So I would just like to welcome everybody. This is a great turnout, and so we're so happy to have Mary Bilder join us tonight to talk about her most recent book, Female Genius, Eliza Harriot and George Washington at the Dawn of the Constitution. It's quite a meaty title, and so we're excited to have Mary share her writings. And I would just like to welcome everybody to the Lane Lyceums. Lyceums have a long history in New England as being a place where ideas that matter can be shared and discussed. And our own Ed Lane, who you see pictured on the screen, this was very much a very important place for people to be able to come, and he really supported the efforts of the Lane Lyceum. So I was so happy to see Mary's picture of Ed on her cover screen. And I would like to ask if people are new to Lane Lyceums or heard about the Lane Lyceums through other than emails. If you would like to be on our mailing list, please put your email in the chat, and I will record that. And so we'll just have you on the list for future Lyceums. And I also ask that everybody mute their screen so that we don't have background noise. And so I will turn this over now to Nancy Nancy Winberry, who has been talking with Mary about doing this program tonight. So okay, so I will turn it over, and welcome to everybody again.
Thank you, Amy. Well, it's nice to be here, and we're thrilled to have Mary, or I should say Dr. Mary Bilder, presenting to us tonight. Mary has an incredible background, and I'll share a little bit about that. But one thing I do want to mention is that Eliza Harriot, the book that Mary is going to be talking about today, is being offered to us at a discount by the publisher. And it's a 30% discount. And I'm going to put that on the chat so that if anybody's interested in purchasing it from the University of Virginia Press, you have the contact information and the code for being able to get it at a discount. Dr. Mary Bilder teaches in the areas of property, trusts, and estates, and American legal and constitutional history at Boston College Law School. She received her BA and a Dean's Prize from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, her JD from Harvard Law School, and her AM and PhD from Harvard University in the history of American civilization and American studies. Not only has she authored the book that she's going to be talking about tonight, Eliza Harriot and George Washington at the Dawn of the Constitution, but also another book that was published in 2017, Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bilder now and thank her for joining us and presenting on her most recent publication.
Well, Nancy and Amy, thanks so much. Nancy, if you can just give me a thumbs up that the audio sounds okay here. Does that sound good? Great. Okay, I just want to welcome everybody, and I'm so delighted that everybody came tonight. I'm a professor at Boston College, but also a member of First Parish, and so I was very pleased to be asked to speak at the Lane Lyceum. And I did put Ed up on the first slide here as the image, because Ed and Helen have been such an inspiration to me and to so many people, and I'm so honored to be able to speak at the series in their name. And I'm a somewhat impatient listener myself, and I always like to know how long does the speaker expect to be talking so I can be prepared. So I've been asked to speak about 45 minutes, and I have 30 slides. So for people who are restless, they can count. And I'm a person who likes to have a lot of images on my slides, so it's sort of a picture book approach to the presentation. And then at the end, I'm happy to answer some questions, or I found a lot of people have reflections about their own lives and the ways in which it resonates with some of the themes of the talk. So my book is the story of this amazing woman, Eliza Harriot Behrens O'Connor, and she was the first public woman lecturer in the United States, the first public woman lecturer at a university, an exceptionally influential female educator, and I argue the inspirer of the gender-neutral language in the Constitution. And I always begin my talks with this quotation, which is what Eliza Harriot wrote about the power of a woman speaking. She wrote, "The exertions of a female should be considered as presenting an example to be imitated and improved on by future candidates for literary fame." And what she means by literary fame there is the kind of fame that somebody else would write about them. And she believed in the power of the example, the influence that one person had by presenting an example that would inspire others, not just to imitate them, but to improve on it, to go beyond. And I think this theory on which she understood her extraordinary lecturing and female schools is still one that speaks to us today about the power of people who are firsts, who do things that are somewhat unusual in our society. So let me find my little cue here. So when we think about this period, the period that I write in, about the framing of the Constitution, we tend to think about the event in the way that public art depicts the moment. The classic image of the framers of the Constitution depict the founding as about the men inside the room. And no one is a part of the story except for those white male delegates. And we can see that here in the images on the left side of the screen. The one on the top is Howard Chandler Christie's very famous signing of the Constitution of the United States. And that's in the House of Representatives. And that portrays all of the delegates in Independence Hall. And the one on the lower left is actually an even larger mural. It's in the rotunda of the National Archives. The figures are almost more than life size. And Barry Faulkner put the delegates outside, but he still didn't add anybody else. They're still only white men. Indeed, Jefferson described these men as an assembly of demigods. And we can see there are no demigoddesses in the picture at all. But Clio, who is the muse of history, was a demigoddess. She was the child of Zeus and Mnemosyne. Mnemosyne was the Titan of memory. And Clio has provided an inspiration for prominent female artists. So you see here Angelica Kauffman, who was one of the first women to be admitted to Male Artist Society, painted her with Frances Anne Auckland. And in Clio's honor, that's the name of our new dog. Some of you have our dog. And Clio reminds us that history creates power by selecting what we remember about the past. And I believe we've misremembered the imaginative space around the framing of the Constitution. And this project is part of a much larger series body of work that I've been working on, trying to describe, instead of framers, a framing generation. Now, similar to the framers, when we think about the role of women in this period, we often think about it the way it's portrayed in this very famous painting by Edward Savage, known as the Washington Family. And we can see here on the left, George Washington and Martha Washington's grandson arrayed with symbols of traditional male power. So we might see that Washington has a globe, Washington has a sword, Washington's wearing riding boots and a military uniform. And on the right, we see Martha Washington and her granddaughter arrayed with what we would consider to be domestic aspects of power. They're both wearing fancy outfits and carrying fans, and they're actually pointing to the future Capitol. And also on the right, we see a figure who most historians believe is William Lee. William Lee was an enslaved man who basically followed and participated with Washington in almost every important event. And we can see the three of them arrayed on the domestic side, the sort of non-powerful public side of this painting. It's interesting to note that there are no Black women portrayed in this painting. No one's depicted, such as the enslaved woman, Ona Judge, who would actually escape in 1796 from Martha Washington. And there's a wonderful book about her by Erica Armstrong Dunbar. In fact, this idea influences sometimes how we read the Constitution. If we look at the clause relating to the president in the Constitution in Article 2, it says a president, he shall hold his office. And in fact, since 1872, 150 years ago, when the first woman, Victoria Woodhull, ran for president, only men have been elected. In fact, if you count, there are 28 male-seeming pronouns related to the president. And that might suggest to some that women were intentionally excluded from the constitutional state, or that the framers could not imagine the possibility of their inclusion. But in 1788, 1 year after the Constitution was written, Hugh Henry Brackenridge, who was a Pennsylvania writer, read the Constitution as open to a female president. He wrote, "The first thing that strikes a diligent observer is the want of precaution with respect to the sex of the president. Is it provided that he shall be of the male gender? What shall we think if in the process of time we would come to have an old woman at the head of our affairs? What security have we that he shall be a white man?" Breckenridge's views on both possibilities are ambiguous, but he revealed the Constitution's semantic gender tolerance. Now, for me, this question about female inclusion in politics arose over an entry in George Washington's diary. George Washington kept a diary when he was at the Constitutional Convention all through the summer of 1787. And in May of 1787, on Friday the 18th, Washington was waiting for everyone else to show up so the convention could start. He'd been staying at Robert and Mary White Morris's house, and he recorded how he had drunk tea at Mr. Morris's. And then he wrote, "After which accompanied Mrs. Morris and some other ladies to hear a Mrs. O'Connell read, a charity affair. The lady, being reduced in circumstances, had recourse to this expedient to obtain a little money. Her performance was tolerable at the college hall." Now, George Washington judged her performance tolerable, a word which has a slightly different meaning than it does today. And we might remember that this is the famous line that Mr. Darcy says of Eliza Bennet the first time he meets her. "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me." And so I judge Eliza Harriot's performance a relative success. The lady that Washington described as Mrs. O'Connell was actually Eliza Harriot Behrens O'Connor. And I call her Eliza Harriot in the book, which is her first and middle name, because that was the part of her name that was her own. Behrens was her father's name, and O'Connor would be her husband's name. And she signed herself repeatedly Eliza Harriot. She's been largely unknown. There are only 5 letters left of hers. And so the project was based in large part on digital newspaper research. And my book reveals Eliza Harriot's remarkable importance to women's rights and her belief that women would someday reach the college and political forum, and her possible influence on the Constitution's gender-neutral language. Now, we have no portrait of Eliza Harriot, but perhaps she resembled her relatives. Her cousin, Catherine Hardy, is portrayed on the left lower screen in a lovely portrait by Thomas Lawrence, and her uncle, Sir Charles Hardy, is portrayed in this George Romney portrait from 1780. And you can see they both have this kind of thin, narrow nose and a little bit of a pointed chin, and so that's how I like to think of Eliza Harriot. And we have no image of John O'Connor, her husband, who, when she met, was an Irish law student at the Inner Temple and was born in Sligo in Ireland. So let me tell you a little bit about the two of them. Eliza Harriot was a child of the early British Empire. Her mother was daughter of the prominent Admiral Sir Charles Hardy. Her father, Benjamin Barons, was himself a merchant and a son of merchants. And she was born in 1749 in Lisbon in the British factory, which was kind of a British outpost for merchants and upwardly mobile gentry. Her mother died when she was very young, when she was about 5 years old, and she traveled repeatedly with her father when he accompanied his brother-in-laws, who became governor of New York and New Jersey. And so she traveled both to New York and New Jersey. During some part of that time, she attended, excuse me, a female boarding school in Chelsea called Mrs. Aylesworthy, which was a quite progressive, liberal French boarding school. She spent time in Charleston, South Carolina in the 1760s when her father was postmaster there. And we can have some sense of the class in which she moved. We can see here the house Rawlins Manor was her uncle, Sir Charles Hardy's house, and Bletchington Park was the house of her cousin, portrayed on the previous page after she got married. Now, her husband-to-be, John O'Connor, we know much less about. He was born in straight off Sligo in an area that was dominated by Irish Catholics. And the Irish Catholics were subject to the penal laws in this period and mostly suppressed by the British. O'Connors in the 1770s and 1780s began to reinsert the O, or, for example, in the name McDermott, the Macs back in their names to indicate their descent from the ancient Irish royal families. Now, O'Connor might have been so descended, but it is also true that a number of O's and Macs went into names in this period with absolutely no connection to royal families, and so we don't know whether he was basically related to the royal families of ancient Ireland or whether he just chose to make it appear as such. He was educated in Dublin at Trinity College and then went to London to the Inner Temple to study to be a lawyer. And it's somewhere there that he met Eliza Harriot. They were married at St. Clement's Danes, which for people who are Jane Austen fans may know it's one of the places that many people believe Wickham married the youngest Bennet sister at. And Eliza and John's marriage was similarly somewhat suspect. None of her family showed up, and she was married just with his family being present. But then her family was very speedy to sort of paper over whatever disagreements they had about the marriage, and her marriage announcement appears in a number of newspapers as the niece of Sir Charles Hardy and heir of Benjamin Barons. They went back to Dublin, where John became a barrister through King's Inn in 1778. Now, it's worth noting that although they might have had children, there is no record of children in the later period about them. So they may have struggled with infertility, they may have chosen not to have children, or their children may have died in the diseases that flooded London and Dublin in this period. In the 1780s, the early 1780s, Eliza Harriot's father dies, and he leaves her money tied up in a trust that John can't touch. And that money will probably have been very important throughout her life in giving her a little bit of income, as you'll see, that protects her from John's constant debts. Now they come of age and are married in a period that I call the age of the Constitution. This is a period when people in England, in Ireland, in the early American colonies are trying to think about who should participate in the state. The word constitution here is still being used to mean political system. And for a number of women, reform raised the possibility of altering a long Western intellectual tradition that embraced female inferiority. All the way back to Aristotle, the Western male tradition had embraced an ideology based on assuming women were inferior. So in the period that we're talking about, a great example of this was in Rousseau's Emile. He wrote, "Which would you esteem the most? A woman whom you found employed in the proper occupations of her sex in the domestic concerns, or a female genius, scribbling verses on her toilette and surrounded with pamphlets of all sorts?" And by pamphlets in this period, we mean political pamphlets. And this idea of female genius, which is the words that we see used over and over again to capture this idea, it's the title of my book, was the notion that arose in this moment that women had equal capacity and therefore they deserved equal education and political representation. And so we can find lots of examples of this recognition of female genius in the 1770s and 1780s, and I'm just going to share a few from the book. So a great example is this portrait. We see Richard Samuels. It's called The Nine Muses of Britain. And Samuels portrayed all of the great women of the period, writers, historians, singers, artists, poets, as an example of how England was entering a new golden age. African-American poet Phillis Wheatley toured London in this period, and Wheatley was described in a very important poem by the poet Mary Hayes in a poet called The Female Advocate as a female genius. And we see here in Phillis Wheatley's poetry book, her being positioned with her hand on her chin and her eyes moving upward, her hand writing in the pen. This is the portrayal of how we see intellectual people writing and thinking. On the lower left-hand side, we see the 1775 painting of Catherine Macaulay. Macaulay was called the female historian. She was a great constitutional historian who wrote 8 big volumes of constitutional history. And she's portrayed here in this portrait as a female senator. She's actually wearing the Roman senatorial sash and standing before what would basically be the political forum. Now, if we move to this slide, this is a wonderful period. It's the little period in which I think it would have been great fun to be in London, because London has a number of female debating societies in this period. And they have names like La Belle Assemblée or the Female Congress. And these debating societies of women debate whether women should have political participation. And those descriptions of the debate topics are published widely in the paper. So this second one is my favorite. Ought not the women of Great Britain to have a voice in the election of representatives and to be eligible to sit in Parliament as well as men? And this period is also a moment when we see the extraordinary activism of the Duchess of Devonshire. Some people may know about this because there was a very good trade fiction biography of her and a movie based on it. In 1780, the Duchess of Devonshire and her friends participated in election activities. And now they didn't vote, but less than 3% of the male population votes in this period. And so the participation of women advocating in this campaign is considered to be very important. And there's an enormous amount of satirical and supportive literature. And so just as an example, the upper image is, you can see people who don't like the Duchess politicking, participating in politics. She's portrayed on the left. And on the right in that picture, you can see what they say is going to happen if you let women participate in politics. Men are going to have to stay home and change babies' diapers. And on the bottom image is a much more supportive image of the Duchess in Devonshire, arrayed very politely with other participants, canvassing for the political campaigns. And this period is also the moment where we have an enormous explosion of women writers. This is the birth of the novel and what people have actually called the feminization of the novel. It's helped by the rise of circulating libraries, and women own circulating libraries and they borrow books from circulating libraries, and circulating libraries create a marketplace for women authors, because instead of having to have the economic resources of owning your own library or owning your own house, or having to ask your male relatives for permission to buy and keep books, with a circulating library, you only had to have enough money to join the library. And similarly, instead of people having to write the kind of literature or history that people would justify with a copy for themselves, that copy could be shared among many, many readers, and therefore the economics of the circulating library radically change the availability of women's fiction. And this is really an incredible period. Most women in this period publish under the name By a Lady, and you can see here Jane Austen's first novel, is Sense and Sensibility, is published that way. The majority of these anonymous ladies are still unidentified. And if we thought about how we imagine women authorship, if we knew who all of those women are, it would really radically change our understanding of this period. 10 of the 12 most popular novels during this period are by women. And Eliza Harriot probably writes 2 novels in this period. You can see here one, Almeria Belmore. It's not a very good novel, but everybody has the same initials and history as her and John. And quite unusually, she signed her own name, E. O'Connor. Now, in the 1780s, you're like, well, when are they into the United States? In 1786, the O'Connors travel to the United States. The revolution is over. The Treaty of Paris has been signed. Eliza Harriot's father has died, leaving them some money. And John and Eliza go to New York. And this is the beginning of a multi-year journey they will take, moving progressively southward along a highway. I'll just put the little arrow here. This is the King's Highway, and it's the central travel path in the 1780s. Moving north and south. And the green cities on this are all areas that Eliza Harriot either speaks at or opens schools. And she will move progressively southward, beginning in New York, where she will be, actually we'll see in a moment, associated with Columbia College briefly, and then ending her career in Columbia, South Carolina, where she will have her last school. And this southward progress is worth sort of pausing over for a moment. Eliza Harriot moves southward, and we'll see in large part this is probably a southward trajectory driven by trying to escape her husband's debts. But it's also a southward trajectory that reminds us of the ever-present realities of white supremacy in this period. What Eliza Harriot sells in some ways is a type of female education that fits very nicely eventually on a sort of Southern slave aristocratic society. And she will also be most successful in the South, where there are enslaved people who can participate and do much of the work that makes her schools more affordable. So in the background of this story, we have to keep in mind the fact that throughout this period, everywhere she lives, slavery is legal, and her schools are most successful in places where slavery is most dominant. Now, she starts in New York, where she advertises in 1786 that she'll open a boarding school as a lady from England. And this school is incredibly successful in 1786. She teaches, this is her advertisement on the left, she teaches English, French, reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, history. It basically looks like a male school with the exception of not teaching Latin. She uses this term genius repeatedly in her ads in referring to her young girls. She also teaches useful and ornamental needlework, and she explains that the advantages of ornamental needlework are that women can do their own ornaments or their own parts of their gowns and purses to look like they have more money than they actually do. She also teaches what was called the art of reading, which was the way of reading that was being taught in this period for men who wanted to join professions like the ministry, politics, or law. And so that's the type of education she's giving. She her school is very, very successful. And when it comes time to do examinations, which she decides to do, she decides to give public examinations just like male schools. And she lists the ladies' names in the newspaper who will be given prizes. And the names of these women are sort of the top families in the United States. The Knoxes are the secretary of the military. The Hillegas and Macomb are basically secretaries of treasury. Harrison is the law partner of Alexander Hamilton. Miss Temple is the daughter of the British ambassador. And when she comes to give exams, she explains in the newspaper that there wasn't enough room in her school. So she asked the professors of Columbia College to use their hall. And they agreed and also helped with the examination. And this is actually her ambition to basically become something like a female college. But in 1787, her husband leaves New York and she has to follow to go to Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the place to be in 1787. It's where the Constitution is about to be drafted. The convention is going to happen. It's diverse and cosmopolitan. It's the largest city in the United States with about 40,000 people. And it's also a place filled with political reform. So in 1787, leading up to the Philadelphia's Constitutional Convention, the Reverend Absalom Jones and the formerly enslaved Richard Allen formed the Free African Society to support the free Black population. The Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery reorganizes, allowing members to expand beyond Quakers. And Philadelphia houses a remarkable group of elite Philadelphia women. Benjamin Franklin's daughter, Sarah Franklin Bache, who's leader of the Lady Association of Philadelphia, which had raised money for the military during the war. Eliza Willing Powell, who will be a great friend of George Washington's, actually persuading him not to resign at the end of his first term, and is the woman who asked Franklin about the type of government and was told a republic if you can keep it. And you might have heard that quotation. She's the missing person on the other end of that conversation. And Eliza Willing Powell Bingham, who we're going to see in a moment, writes Thomas Jefferson. And beginning April 2nd, 1787, and until August of 1787, on almost every day of the Philadelphia newspapers, there is an advertisement for Eliza Harriot's lectures. Her ads for lecturing at the university appear repeatedly throughout the summer of 1787. She gave her lectures at University Hall, which was this place that all male lecturers spoke at. And her lectures promoted Enlightenment bell letters rhetoric, considered the foundation for politics. Her selections were from classics like Milton and Shakespeare and the influential lawyer William Jones. But she always made sure to include a woman author. And the woman she most often picked was Madame de Genlis, who had produced a set of children's books, basically children's literature, and was the first woman allowed to teach the French royal children. While the delegates gathered in May, a column appeared in the Philadelphia paper, probably written by Eliza Harriot, explaining what the purpose of the lady lecturer was. She said she was an example that in this country, the females are found in the society of the sages of the other sex, and that the female would soon command the honors due to the professors of science. And then she predicted that the toilette and the drawing room, those are the two areas in which women are usually found, would be deserted for the forum and the college. She saw her lectures as a step to encourage women to enter politics and higher education. In fact, she gave at the lectures that George Washington attended the most famous political oration, Demosthenes' Prayer on the Crown. All told, there are over 140 ads in Philadelphia newspapers for Eliza Harriot. And because George Washington attended her lecture, basically the lady lecturer went viral, and notices of Eliza Harriot's lecture and Washington's attendance appeared widely across the United States. Now, the unusualness of her lecture can be found by the fact that when I looked for an image in my book of a lady lecturing, I could find no images. Women literally don't lecture in this period. The picture of a woman lecturing or speaking in public that would have been most familiar to people was this type of an image, which is from Giovanni Boccaccio's De Claris Mulieribus, concerning famous women. And this is a picture of Hortensia arguing to the triumvirs. And Hortensia was basically chosen by a group of Roman women to go and argue against basically additional taxation in the Roman Republic. Appian, the Roman historian, has her say, why should we pay taxes when we have no part in the honors, the commands, and the statecrafts? And this is one of the few images we find in this early period of women speaking in public. And just to point out, Hortensia is always portrayed this way there's three triumvirs. There's always one who's falling asleep, one who looks like he's objecting to the thing, and one who looks like he's actually interested. And some of you may be like this in the audience, like the triumvirs. Well, that's not the only thing Eliza Harriot decided to do in Philadelphia. In June, she also put forth a prospectus in many newspapers to establish a Belles Lettres Academy for women. It was to have a governing board, half women, half men, always led by an additional woman, a woman governess, and it would be run by majority rule. And it's in this advertisement that Eliza Harriot writes, the exertions of a female should be considered as presenting an example to be imitated and improved on by future candidates for literary fame. And she went and shared this with Sarah Franklin Bache, sent her plan, and Bache seems to have supported this plan. And Anne Willing Bingham, who is one of the wealthiest women in Philadelphia, very cosmopolitan, also seems to have been inspired by Eliza Harriot. Right after Eliza Harriot's French Academy plan appears in the newspaper, Bingham wrote to Thomas Jefferson, who was in France as the ambassador. And she wrote Jefferson, the women of France interfere in the politics of the country, and they often give a decided turn to the fate of empires. We are therefore bound in gratitude to admire and revere them for asserting our privileges. And privileges there is a political word. We would think about it as the word rights, as much as the friends of the liberty of mankind reverence the successful struggles of the American patriots. Jefferson's a total misogynist, in case you didn't know that, writes back, our good ladies, I trust, have been too wise to wrinkle their foreheads with politics. They are contented to soothe and calm the minds of their husbands, returning ruffled from political debate. They have the good sense to value domestic happiness above all others. And Jefferson is completely unsympathetic throughout his whole life to the notion of female participation in politics. Now, Eliza Harriot's influence that summer might have expanded even beyond lecturing and offering school. In state constitutions prior to the 1787 federal constitution, who can participate in the state is actually ambiguous. A very few number of constitutions use a gender-specific word. That's the word male, but that's the vast minority. Most constitutions use a gender-neutral word like person, inhabitant, sometimes the word man. Now, when we looked at the drafting history of the federal constitution in the summer of 1787, we initially see vocabulary that refers to gender or sex. So Congress, for example, was initially described as two bodies of men. And most importantly, here at the bottom of the screen, you can see the draft language, well, what would become the pernicious fugitive slave clause. It included the word he or she, and this is the only she used in the entire drafting history of the Constitution. And it's such a testament to the power of Black enslaved women's agency that the white slave owner who proposed this language could not think about people escaping enslavement without imagining women. And so that person says he or she shall not be discharged. Well, all of that gendered language is erased by the last draft. Everything becomes gender neutral. And the linguistic vocabulary the Constitution uses is a neutral gendered Constitution. Now, it doesn't appear neutral to us because for us, he has become a gendered pronoun, but it's not in this period. The Constitution repeatedly describes who shall participate in politics in the constitutional state, using the word person, which is a neutral, ungendered word. And then it uses the pronoun he, which we tend to read now as a gendered pronoun, but which at the time was a neutral or generic pronoun. And we know it's a generic pronoun because if you look at the bottom of the screen, this is the part of the Constitution that says states have to give you up if you escape across state lines having committed a crime. And we see that part of the Constitution, which applies to all of us women, unfortunately, if we commit crimes, uses that same person, he construction. So the Constitution over the summer of 1787, while Eliza Harriot speaks and argues for female academies, moves towards a gender-neutral Constitution. But not everyone's so happy with Eliza Harriot, in particular, Benjamin Rush. Now, Benjamin Rush is an incredibly enlightened person in all sorts of other respects. He was anti-slavery. He was involved in all sorts of reformist enterprises. He had married Julia Stockton when she was 17, and they had 13 children.
Wow.
And at the time of Eliza Harriot's lectures, Rush was serving on the all-male board of a new female school, the Young Ladies Academy. They wanted to reform female education, but they wanted themselves to be in charge. And in late July, Rush gave a widely reprinted speech, Thoughts upon Female Education. That speech was designed to destroy Eliza Harriot's plan. Rush took this old idea of female inferiority and he gave it a new American twist. This idea became what historians refer to as Republican motherhood. Gentlemen should direct female education, and the purpose of female education is to train sons and support husbands. As Rush wrote, women should be given a peculiar mode of education, and the goal should be that they become an agreeable companion for a sensible man, the daughter or wife of an American citizen. And when you think about him writing this against Eliza Harriot O'Connor, herself British, her husband Irish Catholic, that American citizen, which sometimes gets read as an almost patriotic thing, has a deeply nativist sentiment. You can see on the lower right side of the screen notebooks from the Young Ladies Academy. And lest any of those young ladies get the wrong idea, the front of those notebooks said and reminded them that the end of the good education they were getting was not that they become dancers, singers, players, or painters. It was to make them good daughters, good wives, good mistresses, good members of society, and good Christians. Eliza Harriot stands no chance. This piece by Rush becomes the most widely published piece on female education. Eliza Harriot has no money, she has no power. Rush has lots of money and lots of power, and his ideas become very prevalent. So Eliza Harriot leaves. She moves southward. She moves first to Baltimore, where she offers lectures on the compass of the human mind, right? The mind understood without respect to gender. And the first person who sells her tickets in Baltimore is Mary Catherine Goddard. Now, Goddard is famous because she was running the print shop in Baltimore. And she's the first person to print the Declaration of Independence with the names of all the signers. And at the very bottom, I don't know if everybody can see this, just below where she prints John Hancock in big letters, Mary Catherine Goddard prints printed by Mary Catherine Goddard. And in the many years that people studied this, only recently, where we turned back to really focus on women in history, have people pointed out the just incredible self-determination that it took to put her own name below all the names of the famous male signers of the Declaration. She moves on from Baltimore to Alexandria. Eliza Harriot starts a school in Alexandria that Washington supports. When her husband again decides to move to North Carolina, Eliza Harriot gets herself invited to Mount Vernon, where she spends 5 days visiting with Martha and George, asking them for their advice on how to deal with basically a career that's constantly following John around. She eventually moves to Charleston in 1790, and she founds a very famous female French and English academy, which is quite successful there, although, as I note, probably in large part because of the advantages of basically selling white female education in a city built on slavery. And this academy is very expansive with multiple instructors and includes teaching astronomy. Now, Eliza Harriot's not the only person in this period to have these ideas. So let me talk a little bit about a far more famous contemporary, Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft is a little bit younger than Eliza Harriot, but her ideas in this period followed the exact same trajectory. In 1787, the year that Eliza Harriot is lecturing and suggesting her big French academy in Philadelphia, Wollstonecraft publishes Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. And Catherine Macaulay, the great historian, starts what will become Letters on Education. 2 years later, in 1789, Mary Wollstonecraft, under a pseudonym, publishes a book called The Female Reader, which is designed to give young women portions of reading that can be read aloud so that they can go into public spaces and basically speak by reading these pieces around. It's the part of reading. And then in 1792, Wollstonecraft publishes Rights of Woman, which is initially positively received in the United States. That was excerpted in the first issue of the Philadelphia Ladies magazine, and you can see the frontis of the Ladies magazine on the lower right-hand corner in 1792. And it's in Rights of Woman in 1792 that Wollstonecraft suggests that women ought to have representatives instead of being arbitrarily governed without a share in the deliberation of government. And they're not the only ones. We can find other editorials and newspapers in this period that describe the idea of excluding women just as a custom. We see here a very widely reprinted one from the Massachusetts Sentinel about the present custom of excluding women from any share in legislation is unjust. Women vote in this period in New Jersey, as do people of color. They vote throughout the 1790s, up through the early 1800s, under a constitution that stated that inhabitants could vote as long as they were worth the equivalent of 50 pounds. And we have many, many poll lists with women's names on them from the 1790s and early 1800s. And in 1793, at Rush's old school, this young graduate, Priscilla Mason, who probably would have heard Eliza Harriot lecture, got up to give the graduation speech. And this speech has now become a primary document, often used in, for example, the high school AP US history curriculum and most college surveys. And Mason said, "Supposing now we possessed all the talents of the orator in the highest perfection, where shall we find a theater for the display of them? The church, the bar, the senate are shut against them. Who shut them? Man, despotic man, first made us incapable of the duty and then forbid us the exercise. Let us by suitable education qualify ourselves for those high departments, and they shall open before us." But this vision was not to be. In the United States in 1792, there was a terrible economic depression. Eliza Harriot's business collapses because of debts of her husband, and they're forced once again to flee. And larger, Mary Wollstonecraft's reputation, this idea of political participation by women, also sees what the historian Rosie Zagari has called a backlash. And there's a lot of different reasons for that backlash, but it results in people moving away from this moment of believing that women might be able to participate in the constitutional state. And very importantly, the new written constitution becomes a tool of exclusion. In 1792, the first new state of Kentucky writes a constitution that describes voters as free male citizens. And every state admitted to the Union after that, between 1802 and 1876, begins by describing voters with an adjective: free, white, usually free and white, ends with some description, person, inhabitant, citizen, but always uses the word male. In fact, in 1807, New Jersey, which had allowed women and people of color to vote, reverses course, excluding both of them with new laws that only allow free white male citizens. Historians traditionally describe the early 19th century as the rise of democracy, but we now understand that it's a rise of a white male democracy, an actual creation of a political state that moves to exclude all possibilities of women and people of color from participating. Eliza Harriot's life goes somewhat downhill in this period. She dies in 1811. We see her last ad on the top from Columbia, South Carolina, where she's teaching what she describes as a feeble attempts at teaching. And her will, she was living in a room in someone's house at her death in 1811. John has completely disappeared, and her will inventories books, spectacles, and her needlework. But what influence did she have? Well, we don't know precisely, but remember what Eliza Harriot said. The exertions of a female should be considered as an example. And if we look carefully in the decades after Eliza Harriot, we see other examples following this path that Eliza Harriot tried to open, each imitated and improved on by the next woman. Many women who follow this path of teaching school, becoming political orators or lecturers, and attempting to argue for suffrage. And so let me just end here with someone who was born precisely 100 years after Eliza Harriot in the town that Eliza Harriot dies in Columbia, South Carolina. And this is Charlotte Rollin. Charlotte Rollin was a Black woman born in South Carolina, educated much like Eliza Harriot, fluent in French and belles letters. And in South Carolina, in 1869, the South Carolina legislature invited any lady to give a speech arguing for women's rights to vote. And only one lady showed up to make that argument, Charlotte Rollin. And there are, to my knowledge, 4 copies of this speech that Charlotte Rollin had published, which is the record of her speech. And she argued that it was a fundamental and constitutional right. The New York Times mocked her argument in the newspaper, but she argued, so should women be permitted to exercise the same privileges and represent their own sex at the ballot. And until that, her rights are held by insecure tenure. And I thought, just in honor of the Lane Lyceum, I would mention that a number of women associated with Unitarian and Universalist movements also followed this very same path, interested in female education, interested in public speaking, and became suffragists. So Olympia Brown, who's the first Universal minister in 1864, she's also the first American minister whose denomination recognized her, basically follows this path. The first Unitarian woman minister is Celia Burley in 1871. She's a school teacher, lecturer, actually on child rights, and then a suffragist. The early Universalist, Judith Sargent Murray, who's a rough contemporary of Eliza Harriot, and writes a very famous piece later published on the equality of sexes, is married to the first Universalist, John Murray, in Boston. And then Frances Harper, who belongs to both the AME and Unitarian congregations, is a teacher, lecturer, abolitionist, suffragist, and a very famous poet and author in this period. And we can see that constellation of issues all tied together, just like the path that Eliza Harriot set forth. So in May of 1787, George Washington heard Eliza Harriot deliver a lecture on the power of being an example. Female genius became a rebuttal to alleged inferiority of women, and the Constitution was importantly framed consistent with this idea. But Eliza Harriot's example inspired male opposition, and in the 1790s, female genius, as it transformed into the rights of woman, faced growing opposition, and eventually the constitutional state excluded it. But who knows what ripples went forth from her lectures, her schools, and her many, many newspaper ads. As an early example of the path from female education towards the college and political forum, I judge her performance certainly more than tolerable. And so thank you all very, very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mary. That was excellent and so amazing. What a fascinating woman. And we're lucky that she was around and that we've learned from her example. We'd like to open up to discussion and question and answer. Do you want to have people raise hands, Mary, or we could do it through chat?
Oh, I think it's nicer if people can talk. That's just my own sense. But if somebody doesn't want to talk and they want to write it in, we can probably capture that too.
Okay. So, Amy, are you still here?
I am.
Okay. Should we unmute ourselves, or how do you want to do it?
Well, why don't people stay muted until they've been recognized? I see Freddie K is already has her hand up. So
oh, good. Okay.
Let's call on Freddie. Would you start us out with questions?
My gosh, thank you so much. That was spectacular. And I have many, many questions. I'll try to narrow them. There are two that I'd like to see if you have anything to say about. One is because of the concentration of your time period, I have to say I'm curious if you have also researched the notion of Native Americans appearing during the constitutional period, talking about where are the women, where are the
Yeah. I mean, so great. I actually wrote a piece last year, I've lost track because of COVID, on 4 Native Nation representatives who go to Philadelphia, shake hands with George Washington in this period, and one of them is a woman. And so that piece, again, it's part of a whole body of work I've done now on trying to make the point that that the framers aren't just the people inside the room. And it's not just context, that people are actually in conversation in important ways. So yeah, it's a great question. And of course, though, the history of particularly in Canada, with female education and education with the Indian school boarding schools is a very sad one also right now.
So did I hear you correctly that among the Native Americans who went, it included a woman who was Native?
Yeah.
Thank you. And how do I find these pieces of yours?
Yeah, so write me, Freddie, and I'll send it to you.
I will. Thank you. Can I ask a second question?
Sure.
Just quickly would be, that's the first time I've learned of anybody other than Lucy Stone who kept her name.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Olivia Brown, it's super interesting. And I don't remember, it's a great question, Freddie, about the order, I don't know whether keeps her name. I can't remember what year she gets married. So I don't know if she keeps her name before Lucy Stone publishes, before they publish this, statement saying why they're keeping their names, or whether she's a fellow traveler. I just don't know which way that goes. But yeah. When I speak and I teach a class in law school, and I always have to be a little bit careful about talking about that, because of course I kept my name. My mother was like, I wish I'd kept my name. But among younger women, there's a little bit of a trend towards, I think, taking your spouse's name, and so that I try to be a little bit more careful maybe than I was 20 years ago about that.
Amazing. Thank you. And I look forward to being in touch.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Phil Griffith.
I had a question about this comment by Washington that he found her remarks tolerable. How should we understand his use of that? I mean, was he going out on a limb to make something fairly positive by a remark like that? Or
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Phil. So that's in his diary. So, that's his own personal diary. He didn't say it to anybody else. And so in part, that's why I find it super interesting, because it's his own, it's his own reflection back on, she was tolerable. But one of the interesting things about Washington is that if you look at women who are pretty intellectual in this period, who are cosmopolitan, Washington's friends with them. He liked women in that sense. He thought of women in that sense as in some ways co-equals. And Eliza Powell, who you see on that screen there, who is herself the daughter and spouse of Philadelphia politicians, is really becomes very close to him. And she's credited with the fact that he does not give up the presidency after the first 4 years. She seems to be the person he listens to. So, you can put Martha Washington in or not, but there's actually quite a lot of work now done on how, unlike Jefferson, who was, maybe there's Jefferson fans here, I'm not, who was basically a total misogynist, Washington, for the time period, seems to have been surprisingly open. Now, he's not completely open. So he supports a school in Alexandria that's not hers. And in this period, the trustees write him saying, female education's kind of a thing. How about we let women in? And he's like, well, it wasn't really what I was thinking about, but I agree with it, but only as long as there's one for every 4 boys. So, tolerable maybe captures a little bit of like what he thought.
Thank you.
Mary, I had a question. If Eliza Harriot was living in the 21st century, like now, what do you think she would be advocating for now? Some of the themes similar or new and different?
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that's very interesting is she's, in this period, she's advocating for what we perceive as women's education, for female education, but she describes it, and this is actually true of what we think of as women's rights activists up until the 14th Amendment, in a way that we would think of as human. So she sees gender and sex as sort of imprisoning in certain ways. And so she's talking about the category of woman as a way of escaping kind of this idea of inferiority, so it's a very different sort of space that she occupies in that sense. But I think she would have been very much an advocate for greater political participation of all sorts of people without respect of sex and gender, and the same of education. And she would probably have been a master of social media, unlike myself, because she actually delays her lecture by a day once it becomes apparent that Washington might come, because she knows that if Washington comes, her lecture will go viral. That every time Washington did anything, every newspaper across the United States published it. And so she basically delays her lecture to make sure Washington should come. And then for sort of 4 consecutive days, she ghost writes articles about herself and Washington's attendance, all of which get picked up across the United States. And so she's able to kind of trade on his influence in a very, modern kind of social media way. She'd probably be a talking pundit on one of those, like, on MSNBC or something like that.
Yeah, we'd enjoy her, I think.
Yeah. Mary, I wanted to ask, she started so many different schools in so many different places. Did those schools continue after she left, or was she building a group of women to carry on, or did they fall apart?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. They fall apart. And this is true of an enormous amount of female efforts at female schools. And in part, that's because women's education has given no state help. And so in a few of the places that she moves later in her life, particularly down in the South, she moves because there's legislation that says they're going to give public monies to education. And then it's all like, actually, we meant boys' education. But schools without state support or a patron support do not survive very much. So one of the stories of her early, sort of in some ways unsuccesses, tells us a lot about the degree to which male education is being benefited by both state support, which it has, and also sort of traditional male models of patrons. The female schools, she's not the only one. After her, like, lots of female schools pop up, and in the 1790s and 1800s, it's just an enormous number of female schools. But it will only be about 20 years later that female schools begin to develop institutional support that allows them to sort of become the kinds of schools that will survive. And so, it's later that you get at the college level places like Mount Holyoke, or what becomes Emma Willard, or schools like that. But there's lots of women trying to do that in this period. It's just the economics of it are not so good.
Bob?
Smart.
Mary, you showed a slide with two versions of the drafting language of the Constitution. The male-only language being replaced by the word person.
Yeah.
Was that intentional? Was that discussed in the course of the adoption of the Constitution? And is there any evidence of an intention to leave things open so that women might be able to continue to vote like they're already voting in New Jersey? And did that get undermined by the states enacting their own constitutions?
Yeah,
Is that-
great question. Yeah, I would love the smoking gun. There is no smoking gun because all that drafting language changes in the very final committee without anybody saying anything. The people who are on that committee, you can, and the book goes into this a little bit, you can tie to people who were very, particularly the main drafter, Governor Morris, to people who were sympathetic to the kind of argument that Eliza Harriot was making, but you can't show anything. All I can show is that in 1787, there were two paths. The Massachusetts Constitution says the word male, and John Adams was explicit that women cannot participate, right? We'll remember Abigail Adams saying remember the ladies. And the US Constitution goes down a different route, despite the fact that we can see that drafting evidence, basically the route that the New Jersey Constitution had, which allowed women to vote. What's important to this for early 19th century women's rights activists is that up until the 14th Amendment introduces the word male into the Constitution, they actually believe that they're going to be able to win an argument that women have the right to participate. And once the word male goes in the 14th Amendment, that changes the whole game. But Lucy Stone early on, and other sort of women's rights activists early on, they don't read the Constitution the way that we read the Constitution. And it's also why the 19th Amendment, when it's passed, can be passed the way the 19th Amendment is. So if you think about the 19th Amendment, which we sort of never ever think about, the 19th Amendment just says that the right cannot be disenfranchised by the states. It doesn't actually technically say women are enfranchised. And one thing that I find very frustrating in the effort to try and get the ERA ratified right now is that some people are making the argument that without the ERA being ratified, women don't, sort of in the original Constitution, don't have any of these rights. And I think that's just A, historically an incorrect reading, and B, I think it's a very dangerous reading because I wouldn't trust that ERA going through at this point. But I think it's a great question. I would have loved, I'd be a bestseller, Bob, if I had like the secret evidence, I'll have to write a novel about it to have like the actual evidence, but.
Right. Yeah, all the witnesses are gone, aren't they?
Yeah, they're all gone. They're all gone. Well, I'll just say, I said to Nancy, one thing that I always am interested in, if people want to talk about, is when I've spoken at a lot of places, a number of people, particularly women, have shared stories about the way that some of the path that happened to Eliza Harriot happened to them. And I'll share a story about my mother. My mother went to college at age 15. To Pembroke College because her mother was dying of breast cancer, and her mother, who had been lucky to be educated at college, was terrified that if she didn't get my mother into college before she died, my grandfather would not think that she should go to college, and her sisters wouldn't go to college. And so my mother went off as a very young, my mom said I was a very, very young college freshman, in this space where being able to go to college was certainly not at all taken for granted for women. And so I'm always interested in whether other people have experiences in their families that are similar to that about women's education.
No?
One thing, help me out here, Mary. I thought I remembered learning at one point that during the Constitutional Convention, no one took notes. No one that was inside the proceedings actually wrote stuff down and brought it out. Is that accurate?
No one took. There are no public notes, but people took private notes.
Ah.
So So there's notes like diary notes of people.
I see. Okay. But nothing that has a bearing on this question.
No, they weren't that interested in this question, unfortunately, for me.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think this has been such an informative evening. We so appreciate you sharing your insights, Mary. It's, it's opened up, ideas that I just didn't know. I just didn't realize how many women, were so outspoken and published, and she certainly is kind of the epitome of women at that time, it sounds like. So it's been wonderful for you to share this with us, and we thank you so much for coming and doing it on Zoom.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm glad to see so many friendly faces. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it.
And just to
Okay.
remind everyone that Mary's book is available through the University of Virginia Press. And I put in the chat the code, which is Bilder 10 or 10 Bilder, I can't remember, as the special code for getting a 30% discount if you'd like to purchase the book. I think many of us would like to read more about her.
There's a lot of pictures too. So even though it's a university book, press book, it reads along pretty good. Not quite big bestseller trade, but not too bad, I think. So, with lots and lots of pictures, because that's the part I like the most. Anyway, thank everyone for coming. I just really, really, really appreciate it.
Well,
Thank you.